Hello, and welcome to the Girlfriend God podcast, a podcast in search of and in service to the divine feminine, bringing you an equal mix of academic research and emotional, spiritual experience. If you enjoy the Girlfriend God, please share it, rate it, or leave a review. Let's get in the flow. Just in case you didn't know, so today I welcome Dr. Angela Puca to the show. Dr. Angela Puca is a Ph.D. in Anthropology of Religion and has taught at Leeds Trinity University since 2016. She's the author of several peer-reviewed publications and co-editor of the forthcoming Pagan Religion in 5 Minutes. Looking forward to that. For Equinox, and you can find Dr. Puca at Angela Puca 11 on Twitter, or just search for Angela's Symposium on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. I highly recommend the YouTube channel. I love it so much, and I learned so much, just from your, what do you call it, academic nuggets, those real short videos. Those are my favorites.
I've stopped doing those. Now you're making me want to do them again.
Oh, yeah, I like it. Well, today's online presence has a very short attention span. So, and so Dr. Carla Ionescu, creator of the Girlfriend God. You're not the creator of the Girlfriend God. I'm the creator of the Girlfriend God, the creator of the Goddess Project podcast. There's a lot of onomatopoeia in both of our podcast titles. So she's going to be here today with me as a guest co-host, and I'm sure that we will both have a lot of questions. And today we're going to be talking about shamanism, particularly Indigenous and Transcultural Shamanism in Italy. Dr. Puca, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, Kelly and Carla. I'm pleased to be here with you.
I do have a couple questions that I think you'll probably cover anyway, but just as kind of a starting point, my two questions because I made a couple notes before the show. One was, is there a link between shamanistic journeying and the witch folklore of fly agaric? And two was, can anyone be a shaman with the proper training, or must it occur in your ancestral bloodline, or are there other requirements to be able to call yourself a shaman?
Well, to answer those questions, we need to set the background knowledge and information to answer those. Obviously, what I'm going to talk about is not what I think. If you want to know what I think, we can also cover that, but I will cover primarily what my research is about and what emerged from my research. So one thing that we need to clarify is that it is quite challenging to define what a shaman is and what shamanism is. And it is still controversial in academic circles. So the way I define shamanism is by using two methodologies. One is called the deictic approach that comes from Michael Lambeck work, and deictic comes from the Latin word deixis, which refers to terms that don't have a meaning in and of themselves, but only when put into relation with other things. So for instance, words like here and there, these are meaningful words, but in order to understand what they mean, you need to put them in a context. And then the second aspect of our methodology is discourse analysis that comes from Foucault, basically. And a lot of quite many scholars in religious studies at the moment, especially those who work with paganism, pagan religions, shamanism, witchcraft, they tend to use discourse analysis because these are traditions that don't have a central dogma. They're not institutionalized. And so in order to understand them in their own right and without making them into something else just to make them easier to pinpoint and scribe, what we do is to use this methodology called discourse analysis, where you identify patterns of meaning that emerge from the community itself, from these discourses and the practices that the community creates. Obviously, it's not based on what every single person says, but when you collect enough data, you will find that there are patterns of meaning, and that will give you an answer as to what a certain religious phenomenon is. So when it comes to shamanism, we need to first clarify that shamanism is a term that emerged from Russian ethnography from the 19th century. And there have been in the past, decades ago, scholars who have said, you can only use shamanism when it comes to the Siberian forms of shamanism because that's where the term comes from. Well, the term doesn't come from there. The term is a scholarly term that was superimposed over local specific identifiers. So there is one region in Siberia, the Tungusic region, where the term shaman was a native term to refer to their shamans. But if you move slightly, you will find that in a different town, a different area, they will have another term to refer to their shamans. So one thing that tells you that a shamanism is indigenous is that usually they have local specific terms to identify those people that have this ability to engage with reality in a non-ordinary way so that they can gather power and knowledge and healing for their community. So in every indigenous shamanism that you find around the world, they will have their own words. So the term shaman, the way we understand it today, is a scholarly construct. It wasn't even, even the concept of shamanism was not even native of the Tungusic area. It was just, the term shaman that was understood in a very context-specific way. So when I hear the argument of people saying, oh, shaman should only be applied to Siberia, it's like, why? It was imposed by scholars to begin with, even on Siberian forms of shamanism. So we need to understand first that shamanism is a scholarly construct and it superimposes over local specific labels. It doesn't mean that it has to erase them. In fact, it is important to keep the local specific terms. But it is a fact that even among indigenous people, for instance, I have done field work with the Mapuche shamans in Argentina, who are also in Peru, by the way. And they will use the term shaman because now it is widely understood. So people, as always, there are several influences. It's not just the case that scholars understand indigenous traditions and there is only a one-way kind of influence. Every party that is involved in the construction of meaning and in the knowledge making will influence each other. So you will find that scholars will influence practitioners and practitioners will obviously affect the scholarly understanding of their practices. So it's kind of a two-way thing. It's not really just a one way, like the scholar that observes very objectively. I really don't like the word objective. I think that I haven't met a religious studies scholar who likes that term yet, but if I also have to say that I'm surrounded by people that study things like paganism, so that's also understandable why that is the case. Probably theologians will have different take, but so first of all, we clarify that shamanism is a scholarly term even when it is applied on the Siberian region. And then after the first occurrence of the term and usage of the term, you will find that scholars that study other forms of shaman, other forms of similar practices around the world, especially among indigenous people, will start to use the term shamanism as well, because they find that they are similar enough so that the term is meaningful, because that's what a term is for. A term is, exists so that you can understand what you're talking about. And when you have enough similarities that the term is meaningful, then you can apply it. It makes sense too, because language is about understanding each other.
So is the word sorry, this is what I do. I interrupt when I have questions. So is the word journeying a similar thing? Because that's, and you've got to keep in mind that, like, I'm coming from the West, where we tend to take these scholarly terms and apply them to things they don't necessarily apply to because the people using the terms don't understand the context. I mean, I know that shaman is a term in the United States, at least in this area of the United States, that is as generic as the term witch or the term priestess. Like anybody can call themselves these things and not really have an understanding of what those terms actually mean. I mean, that's part of this podcast and your podcast and Carla's podcast, right? Is that there's this huge disconnect between these spiritual practices and what those spiritual practices actually mean, where they came from, and there's so much misinformation online. Like you mentioned, Siberia, and that's what I read this morning. It is a tradition that's started in Siberia, and this is what it means, and they don't expand any further beyond that. Like I feel like people in the United States think that the word shaman has existed since ancient times.
No, it hasn't.
Well, I know that, and you know that, and Carla knows that, but the average Googler doesn't, right?
Yeah. But yeah, to answer the whether journeying is also a Western construct, the way we understand it, yes, it is a Western construct. Um, Another thing that I was going to mention when it comes to shamanism is that there are two main forms of shamanism that I identified in my research. One is the indigenous shamanism, and the other one is transcultural shamanism. So transcultural shamanism is the one that you will find most in Western countries, and it tends to be focused on the techniques. For instance, core shamanism, Michael Harner, Carlos Castaneda. Carlos Castaneda, still had some cultural elements in his practice, and Michael Harner had learned. He said that he had learned shamanism from the Conibo and the Shivaro um, in the Amazon. But the focus of transcultural shamanism is the technique, meaning that you learn the technique, for instance, the shamanic journeying or other such techniques in shamanistic techniques, and you apply them. And you're supposed to get the same exact results. You don't need an initiation. You don't need to be a specific person. Anybody can do it. And whether you are in Italy or in the UK or in the US, you're supposed to get the same exact results. It's based on the techniques. You learn the technique and then you apply it, and that's it. Whereas indigenous shamanisms are extremely connected to the culture, to the land, to the bloodline, to elements that are very specific to a place, very specific to certain types of people, and very specific to a certain culture. So you can see that indigenous shamanism tends to be more locally and culturally based, more culture sensitive, and whereas transcultural shamanism tends to be about techniques that are transcultural, so you don't need an initiation, whereas in indigenous shamanism usually you do need an initiation. Only certain people can be shamans. In transcultural shamanism, anybody can be a shamanic practitioner. In core shamanism, they say that only other people can say that you're a shaman. You can say for yourself that you are a shamanic practitioner, but others will have to identify you as a shaman so that you are a shaman, but it's not something that you say yourself. And quite a few transcultural shamanic practitioners in Italy reported the same thing. There's one of my informants who said, shaman is like beautiful. You cannot say to yourself because otherwise it doesn't make, it's not meaningful. Whereas if somebody else tells you, then, it becomes a meaningful expression. So that was an interesting thing that he said. But yeah, that's the difference between transcultural and indigenous shamanism. So now I can answer with context your question. So the journey, the idea of the shamanic journeying is very Western. I mean, it's not that in indigenous shamanism you don't find the journeying, because you do. It's just that the way we understand it when we talk about shamanic journeying, meaning, that you listen to, or you play the drums and the rattles, and you go to the lower, the middle, and the upper world. This way of journeying that we are used to think about when we talk about shamanic journey. That's transcultural shamanism, and it was popularized by core shamanism, founded by Michael Harner. And yes, in that sense, anybody can do that, because as we just said, transcultural shamanism is not um is not something that only initiates can do. Anybody can do that.
Right. Like I read somewhere in my um because Ellen of the Ways is kind of my patron goddess and she's an antlered goddess. I read somewhere in my research on nomadic deer tribes and reindeer herding tribes that, they traveled with the herd and they would, I don't know if it was fly agaric, but they ingested something that would allow them to do that kind of journeying where they could see, where they could take on the form of a bird and fly above and see the whole herd and where they were going and where they were coming from. But I would suspect that those tribes didn't call it shamanic journeying, right? I mean, based on what you've said so far, they probably likely called it something else. And then
Yeah, I think they would probably.
I'm sure there were only certain people in the tribe that could do it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know about this specific tribe, but um, definitely when you look at indigenous shamanisms, you will find a lot of things that you could associate to astral projection or shamanic journeying or the flight of the witches, but these are our interpretations, and they flatten the complexity of what the actual phenomenon is about. So I am
Right.
against collapsing things that are different just to make them simpler for us to
Right, right.
understand, because otherwise you also lose the meaning and the specific elements of that practice.
Okay. Thank you. Carla, questions so far? You're muted.
Okay, my apologies. Sorry, I couldn't find the button. No, I don't know if I have any questions so far. I think that that's really fascinating. I understand about the term shamanism. What makes me wonder, what makes it fascinating, I guess, is that um when you said that now the indigenous cultures apply it to themselves in order to really identify themselves for others. I think that's really fascinating, the way that um academia influences, let's say, everyday language, then influences culture, which influences academia. It's fascinating because often academia doesn't really influence everyday people too much, well, I don't know if that's fair, but you get a little blurb or like a little short piece from academia and people kind of take it and run with it. But this label is really fascinating. Because the same, I know South American shamans that refer to themselves as shamans, to sort of let others know that this, so for example, from Brazil, I have a couple of friends that are shamans in Brazil, and they identify, especially when they do retreats and stuff, as shamans. So that's really fascinating. Yeah.
I think that academia always influences things to different degrees, sometimes to a very small degree, and very often decades after the research has come up. But I think there's always some kind of influence of academic research, especially when it comes to social science, anthropology. But
So I
probably
think we're influenced by academia. We just don't always know that we're influenced by academia.
Well, if we want to get philosophical about it, I'd say that we are influenced by everything that we come in contact with, not just academia. It's not like it is this big brother thing that tells you what to do when it observes you.
Right.
It's more the case that we are generally influenced by all the things that we are surrounded by, the information that we get, and how impactful that information is on people around us. So if you have a study, an academic study that is impactful on certain people around you or people in your community, it is much more likely that it will influence you as well.
Right.
Yeah. I guess the dilemma comes when the context around the academic study isn't explained properly or isn't transmitted as well. Because people don't read, peer-reviewed journals for fun very much. So it's kind of what makes it in the news, right? And what kind of makes it into, or like a teacher will take a peer-reviewed study and then sort of summarize that for her students. But yeah, the details of the study themselves sometimes get a little bit, fall through the cracks a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, and also there's the matter of also understanding how peer-reviewed research works. That is not just about one study, especially when we talk about the natural science, medicine, biology, and these sort of fields. It's not about one study, and that's a very common misunderstanding that I find in the general public. There's one study on, I don't know, 20 or even 200 people, and you have the journal article that says, a magazine article that says study finds, headline, and it is just one study, but it's not how research works. Research works by a network of studies. So if you only have one study that suggests something, and it is absolutely important for that study to publish their findings, but if they are in contradiction with all the other studies all around the world, especially with that are done at a larger scale studies or more recent studies, then that one study on 20 people is not as relevant in understanding the specific phenomenon that you're trying to understand. I saw a lot of that during the pandemic, a lot of misunderstanding as to how research works, and just citing studies that hadn't passed peer review, or were very small scale studies, or studies that were not had not you'd find that other studies were not able to replicate the same results with similar methodologies. So that's also something that is important to highlight, especially for those who are interested in academic knowledge and want to gather, how can I get a proper understanding or gather knowledge on a specific subject academically.
Dr. Puca, I just want to say I will go back in my research because I'm really because I'd like to share with you what I read about these deer cults and them what they called journeying, or at least what the writers called journeying to see above the whole reindeer flock. It was just really interesting. So I'd like to share that with both of you. So can we talk a little bit about the disconnect between academic research in this area, and shamanism in particular, and what I see as a problem in the US with non-academic people and spiritual practices in general? Okay. So how do we overcome that? How do we overcome the modern day spiritual seeker dilemma of misinformation?
So do you mean, I don't think that I understand the question, to be fair. So is it about modern practitioners needing to be more informed about their practices?
Yes.
So, well, as you know, I'm a scholar, so I don't think that, if you are following a specific religion or a specific spiritual practice, you should necessarily be informed academically. It is more a case of when there is a claim on the part of practitioners that is false. So, for instance, if I'm following my own spiritual journey or my own religious journey, and I feel that connecting to, I don't know, a certain representation of Diana improves my spirituality and makes me feel better and makes me feel more connected with everything around us and around me, then, go for it. But if you then claim that that representation of Diana is historical and it comes from, I don't know, a specific place in Italy, and and that is not true, that's where I have a problem as a scholar and as somebody who likes accurate information and factual representation of things. So I think that as long as a practitioner has a clear distinction in mind as to what is their own spiritual practice and what is factual historical information, then I personally don't have a problem with that. I've, an example for me is Stregheria, the American tradition that claimed to be Italian. So I have a problem with that as a scholar and as an Italian because there's nothing Italian about it. But but if you have a person, if there's a person who follows Stregheria and they find meaning in it and it enriches their life, I'm happy for you. It is for me the problem. For me, the problem is when people claim that Stregheria is the authentic Italian witchcraft, created by an American who wasn't even able to speak Italian. So obviously, for me as an Italian who has also studied Italian witchcraft in my research, that is a gnoseological problem because that's not a fact. That's not true in terms of history and the factual information that you're giving. But I don't have anything against people that practice it, because if it helps their spiritual journey, then I'm happy for them, as long as they realize that is not, that what they're doing is a practice that is a spiritual practice and has nothing to do with Italian witchcraft.
Right. Were you talking about Raven Grimassi?
Yes, of course.
He could not even speak Italian.
No, he wasn't able to. I know because I participated in conversations where he was trying to explain to actual Italians the meaning of things that he had no idea what they meant. So
yeah. But that's a really, Raven Grimassi is a really good example of what I'm talking about, right? Very popular in the West. People took his word as gospel.
In the West, in the US, you mean?
And well, yeah, in the US.
Even in Canada, I'm not sure.
I haven't heard of it in Canada, to be honest. I haven't heard of this group in Canada as a practice, like as a practicing group. Most Italians I know are Catholic. In fact, all Italians I know are Catholic. And we haven't even had anyone bring it up. So I'm not sure if it's practiced in Canada, unless it's in a very small Italian circle.
I think it's very popular in the US because I get, since I've done research on Italian witchcraft, and actually I systematized in my research Italian witchcraft as a whole for the first time, when, he claimed that there was something like Italian witchcraft, and there wasn't up until 20 years ago. So it was very regionally based, but I think that it's quite popular in the US because I get a lot of messages from Italian Americans that, and for instance, I sympathize with them. I sympathize with those Italian Americans that want to reconnect with their heritage. And I think that that's very common in the US, regardless of your heritage, that people want to reconnect with their heritage. And I think that that's admirable. The problem is that when, there is a very Americanized understanding of things that are far away in time and geographically. But
right.
yeah.
I mean, maybe that is so for me, I want people's spiritual practice to be more, I don't know, research proven, I guess, but perhaps that is just the dilemma of the academic spiritual person, right? Of the academic spiritual seeker. Because when I'm interested in something, I do that, right? I will research as much as I can outside of a paywall or outside of being in an academic setting, um, because I want to know that what I'm doing is authentic, I guess.
Mm.
Like I did a lot of research on my own ancestry and then started to research, mythology from that particular area of the world. Like on my mother's side, there's a lot of Polish, Czechoslovakian, Yugoslavian, Eastern European descent. So I started reading about, traditional witchcraft or traditional spiritual beliefs in those areas of the world. But I realized that I am not your average spiritual seeker, right?
Mm.
So,
I
like
think
I
that
said,
there
maybe,
is, I think that there is generally an interest in academic scholarship among practitioners, especially those who practice paganism, witchcraft. There is also an interesting book by a German professor called Coco von Stuckrad called The Scientification of Religion. And there
oh,
are a couple of chapters on paganism and shamanism and how they were and are heavily influenced by academic scholarship. There might be different reasons as to why that is. I think that probably one of the reasons is that when you practice witchcraft and you are a pagan, you are already kind of at the fringe of what is acceptable by the dominant cultural framework. And since academia and science are accepted, so you're kind of trying to get more sort of a sense of validation by doing that. And also because I think for some people, as you said, Kelly, the historical validity of a specific practice is important. That's why you have, for instance, reconstructivists that try and, for instance, in Italy, you have like Roman reconstructivists and Hellenic reconstructivists from depending on the part of Italy. In the south, you will find more Hellenic reconstructivists because obviously there was more influence from Greece and from Egypt. In the Midlands, more Roman influence, and in the north, you also had Celtic influence. So you will find that reflects in the kind of reconstructivist movements that you find. And those who are in reconstructivist movements tend to value a lot the historicity and the historical accuracy. I think that movements like Wicca, eclectic Wicca, and eclectic witchcraft tends to be more focused on the results that you get from your magic, the results that you get from your practice, your spiritual practice or your magic practice. And so in that sense, the information and the accuracy of the background information is less important. It's the same with chaos magic. Chaos magic basically says all these centuries of ceremonial magic practices, let's just put them aside and make up our own correspondences and our own sigils, and what matters is that they work. So I think there are different approaches to spiritual practices, some that tend to value more the accuracy of information and knowledge that you base your practice on, and others that tend to value more perhaps the results and the kind of benefits in your life, whether they be spiritual or material or whatever that you get in your life. So I think that there are different approaches. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that a lot in witchcraft culture in the US is very results focused. And as a spiritual seeker, I I get frustrated with that because in my spiritual path, part of my spiritual path is a reverence for what or who I'm working with. But I see a lot of witches who just want to use the goddess that they're working with is their errand girl. And I don't know. Personally, I don't think it's supposed to work that way. Maybe I'm wrong, and if it's working for them, then good for them. But I don't know. I think when I start taking things personally in the US, it's because there's such a disregard for, I don't know, for tradition or for elder leadership. There's a big lack of that. And maybe it just comes from being a young country. But you mentioned, Dr. Puca, you mentioned correspondences, and that is probably one of the biggest complaints I have about information that is on the internet. Because if you type in the name of any goddess, Diana or Artemis or Athena or Aphrodite or Ellen of the Ways, if you type in that goddess's name and correspondences, you will find conflicting information. I cannot tell you how many times I have tried to find out the correspondences to a particular goddess, and this person says that this goddess is, there's a million associations, right? What flowers is she associated with? What animals is she associated with? What crystals and gemstones is she associated with? What parts of the world is she associated with? And you can look at 10 different websites and get 10 different answers. And I want to know. You know what I mean? I want to know if the goddess I'm working from comes from cultural mythology, that the crystal that's associated with her um, comes from the part of the world that her folklore and mythology comes from. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, when it comes to correspondences related to pre-Christian deities, even in the history, you will find contradictory information, because I think that also the way contemporary practitioners understand ancient deities now sometimes doesn't take into account that certain deities, for instance, Diana, or any Roman or Greek deity, they were not Unitarian as we would think.
Right.
You will find that they were worshipped in different ways depending on the time, depending on the place. So you will find at a specific time and at a specific place. For instance, before the Hellenization of Rome, the Roman gods were forces of nature. It was very animistic. And then after the Hellenization, they become personified. So what is the right one? Is it the the force of nature, or is the personified version? Both are. It just depends. So I think that the problem that the modern practitioner faces, even when they want to be accurate in the way they do things, is that the way we want to understand sometimes deities now is very different from how it was in the past.
Right.
So that's a difficulty that I definitely want to interview more reconstructivists to ask those kind of questions to them, because I find, especially for reconstructivists, because they really want to stick to what the history says.
Right.
And I have interviewed some from Rome, and they tend to stick to a specific period, so they tend to be accurate in that respect. So they say that they are connecting to the deities from this specific time, so they chose a specific time, and they also had a reason for that, because it's the time when you had more a bit of a more unified understanding of those deities, and you have more sources from that specific time, with Ovid, for instance. So they choose a specific time and a specific way of interacting with those gods, instead of looking at the entirety of the history around those gods, because otherwise you will find I'm not talking about websites, I'm even talking about
right.
You will find contradictory information, because that's how things are. Even in Christianity, that's very dogmatic and institutionalized. You will find that across different centuries, the perception of the Trinity or some foundational concepts in Catholicism, for instance, have changed.
Right. I do ask all my guests the same three questions at the end of the show, but before I do that, what's the one takeaway that you want the listeners to have from this? And hopefully, you will come back and we can do this again. I know that sometimes people come on the show and my style is very much to like interrupt you with questions. So if you come with material prepared, chances are you won't get to it. And I'm working on that. I interrupted you far less than I have interrupted others, right? Look, Carla's shaking her head. Yep, yep. By the way, I heard you as I was walking away, and the dog's names are Ruby and Bella.
That's right. That's right.
They're very
Bella.
happy to be inside. It's cold outside. Anyway, one takeaway?
One takeaway is to, wow, I don't know. I'd say one takeaway from this interview, I hope that people have challenged their preconceptions about shamanism and about academic scholarship. It can be fun. And I try to make it on my Angela Symposium YouTube channel.
You do. That YouTube channel, I mean, it's very accessible to the non-academic. I've directed a lot of other people to it, so I'm really glad that you're doing that.
Thank you.
So the three questions I ask all the guests at the end of the show are fun and non-academic. The first question is, tell us a fun fact about yourself that people that know you well would be surprised to learn.
I feel your pain. I feel your pain.
Yeah, the thing that I don't know how to answer to is that people that know me would be surprised to, because the fun things about me, people that know me will be aware of them. So I don't know, the fact that I eat a lot of chocolate.
Okay, that counts. Tell us about your current favorite TV series or movie.
Oh, my current favorite TV show, I'd say that Strange Angel, because there's a representation of Telema, the Crowley's tradition. So yeah, I found that one interesting.
Yes,
so I like that one.
Me too. And the whole first season and kind of the unveiling of Aleister Crowley and all that stuff. Yeah, it's a good show. What song, this is the last question, what song would be the theme song of the soundtrack of your life? And it can be something we've never heard of.
It can be, or it cannot be.
No, it can be.
Oh, it can be. I don't know, because I don't want to. The first song that comes to mind is kind of a bit dark, and I'm not sure I would want it to be the soundtrack of my life. I would need more songs to make the soundtrack. I like the opening song of Outlander.
Oh, okay. Yes, me too.
I also like the lyrics.
Yes.
It's a great song.
It's an amazing theme song. Like I said, we get all kinds of answers. Kendall's theme song is the Imperial Death March. So, well, thank you, Dr. Puca. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. Thank you for putting up with my War and Peace length emails about what we could or couldn't or should or shouldn't talk about. And I do hope that you come back and see us.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Carla and Kelly, for inviting me.
We'll see you soon. Carla, can you stay on for a minute?
I'll stay on. Thank you so much, Dr. Puca.
Thanks, Dr. Puca.
Thanks for watching or listening. If you want more of The Girlfriend God, you can find The Girlfriend God and The Girlfriend God podcast on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. The Girlfriend.